The image we have is that of the noble warrior in his impeccable armor, fighting and dying loyally for his lord. But what if I told you that one of the greatest victories in Japanese history, an event that challenged the greatest empire the world has ever seen, wasn't won precisely out of honor? We believe that history is made by colossal armies and brilliant generals. But the truth is, often, that the destiny of nations is forged in utter despair, by the hands of ordinary men, indebted and willing to risk everything, not for an ideal, but for a reward. In 1281, the largest armada the planet had ever seen, 4,400 ships and over 140,000 soldiers of the invincible Mongol Empire, was anchored off the coast of Japan. Its fall was certain. Surrender was logical. But they hadn't counted on the darkness. And they hadn't counted on small groups of men, perhaps 80 at a time, rowing in tiny boats, in deadly silence, toward the heart of the enemy fleet. What happened on those nights in Hakata Bay that broke the momentum of the greatest empire on Earth? In this video, you're not just going to hear the myth of the divine wind. You're going to discover the real story, recorded in the scrolls of a samurai who was there, fighting not only for Japan, but for his own financial survival. You're about to understand how the greatest naval war in medieval Japan was won, not by an army, but by a series of suicidal guerrilla operations. This is the story of when 80 samurai made the Mongol Empire tremble. If you're fascinated by stories that transcend fiction, that show history as it truly is, raw, human, and desperate, then please leave a like to support our work. By subscribing, you help spread true knowledge and help us debunk myths. By the way, comment below which city or country you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far this knowledge can reach. And of course, if there's an epic story, a forgotten event, or a mystery from the past that you'd like to see dissected here, leave your suggestion in the comments. Your idea could become our next video. Now, prepare yourself. Khan's shadow is on the horizon. In the mid-13th century, the known world trembled. The Eurasian soil, from Poland to Korea, had felt the thunder of 1,000,000 horses' hooves. This was the era of the Mongol Empire, a force forged in the unforgiving cold of the steppe by a man whose mere mention of his name brought silence to taverns and panic to royal halls. Genghis Khan. He had united rival tribes and created not just a nation, but a war machine fueled by unwavering loyalty and revolutionary logistics. When Genghis died, his legacy was not an empire, it was a blaze. His sons and grandsons inherited that fire, and none burned with a more complex flame than his grandson Kublai. In 1260, Kublai Khan became the Great Khan. But he was different. He was not just a warrior of the steppe. He was an administrator, an intellectual, a man who saw the future not only in conquest, but in civilization. He moved his capital to the heart of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. He had conquered the powerful southern Song dynasty, unifying China under Mongol rule for the first time in history. He ruled from Beijing to Baghdad. But for a man who conquered everything, what was left to wish for? The answer lay beyond the water. To the east, across the treacherous South China Sea, lay break up Japan, the island of the rising sun, as Marco Polo would later call it. A land of rival warlords, ruled by a divine emperor, but controlled by a military dictator, shogun, and its ruler of the Hojo clan. For Kublai Khan, Japan was two things, an insult and an opportunity. It was an insult because it was the last significant stronghold in East Asia that refused to bow down. Korea-Goryeo was already a vassal state. Japan, however, remained proudly isolated, a stubborn endpoint on his map of dominion. It was an opportunity because legends spoke of a place of fabulous wealth, a golden palace, an exaggeration that Kublai took seriously. Subjugating Japan would not only be an achievement, it would be the culmination of his imperial vision, the ultimate proof that he had surpassed even his grandfather. The whole world would be at his feet. In Kamakura, the capital of the shogunate, life went on. The samurai clans practiced their martial arts, focused on internal disputes and personal honor. They knew little about the outside world, and even less about the power now concentrated in Beijing. They had no idea that the greatest war machine the planet had ever produced was turning its eyes toward their shores. The shadow of the Mongol Empire was long, and it was about to engulf Japan. The night in Hakata Bay brings no peace. There are no stars, The air is heavy, salty, thick with the smell of wet wood, sweat, and something else. The smell of 100,000 confined men, a stench of disease and fear emanating from the darkness ahead. It is 1281. In a small wooden boat, a Kobayashi samurai is crouching. He's not wearing his large armor. Oyoroa wears only light, tight-fitting clothes, a leather breastplate, and his swords. His eyes are fixed ahead. Beside him, 7 other men row. The oars are wrapped in rags to muffle the sound. The only noise is the clap-clap gentle flow of water against the hull. Wherever they look, there is no horizon. There is only a wall, a black forest of masts that scratches the sky. What is anchored in the bay is not an army. It is a floating city of terror. 4,000 ships, colossal war junks, some over 100 meters long, connected by chains and planks, creating a fortress at sea. Kublai Khan's fleet. Japan has been under siege for weeks. The defensive walls on land have prevented the Mongol cavalry from landing, but the fleet remains. They cannot be defeated. They will not leave. The stalemate is killing Japan, exhausting its resources, breaking its spirit. Logic dictates that the war is lost, but logic has no place in this bay. The man in the boat tightens the cable of his boarding hook. He and his companions, perhaps 80 men in total, divided among 10 boats like this one, are not on a mission of victory. They are not trying to sink the fleet. That would be impossible. They are on a mission of pure terror, a suicide mission. They slip into the shadow of one of the giant warships. The wooden hull rises like a cliff. They know most won't return. They know they are rowing into the heart of the greatest war machine on the planet. But passive defense has failed. Honor now demands the unthinkable. If they cannot fight the army, they will hunt the men, one by one, in the dark. This is the night the samurai, the warriors of the land, will become ghosts of the sea. The night they will try to make the Mongol Empire itself feel fear. Before the first arrow was fired, before the first ship set sail, came the war of words. In 1266, Kublai Khan, now Emperor of Yuan China, sent his first letter to the King of Japan. It was a silk-wrapped document, written with the arrogance of a conqueror and the politeness of a trap. The letter was a classic example of Mongol diplomacy. It began with a greeting, acknowledging Japan as a neighbor. And then came the steel. It spoke of Kublai's mandate of heaven, of how countless distant kingdoms had voluntarily submitted to his glory. It praised the benefits of trade and friendship, but the underlying message was unmistakable. In one passage it said, ... we ask that, from now on, we enter into friendly relations. We fear that if we are forced to resort to arms, it will be something that none of us desires. It was a veiled ultimatum: bow down or be crushed. The imperial court in Kyoto, where the puppet emperor resided, panicked. They advised surrender. The idea of resisting the man who had conquered China was madness. But the real power was not in Kyoto, it was in Kamakura, with the shogunate, and specifically with the regent, Shikon Hocho Tokimuni. Tokimuni was only 18 years old, but he was the leader of the Hojo clan, which ruled Japan with an iron fist. He was also a devout practitioner of Zen Buddhism, and his spiritual master had taught him to rule without fear, to confront chaos with an unwavering center. For Tokimuni, Kublai's letter was not a negotiation. It was an insult to the sovereignty of Japan and the honor of his lineage. He did the unthinkable. He didn't even answer. Kublai Khan, the most powerful man in the world, was ignored. He sent more emissaries. In 1268, 1271, 1272, each time Kamakura's response was silence or rejection. Tokimuni was playing a dangerous game. He was effectively telling the great Khan that Japan was beyond his reach. Finally, Kublai's patience ran out, but so did Tokimuni's. When the last delegation arrived in 1273, demanding an answer, Tokimuni decided to give one that no empire could misinterpret. He ordered the Mongol emissaries to be taken to Tatsunokuchi Beach and executed. This was not an act of war. It was a fundamental breach of universal diplomatic protocol. Envoys were sacred. By beheading the great Khan's envoys, Hojo Tokimuni was not merely rejecting suzerainty. He was declaring that Japan and the Mongol Empire could not coexist. Diplomacy was dead, and its tombstone was a samurai's blade. There was a saying among the Mongols: you cannot have two suns in the sky, just as you cannot have two Khans on earth. Tokimuni had drawn a line in the ocean. Kublai Khan was now bound, by honor and strategy, to erase it. The first invasion was now a certainty. In November 1274, Kublai Khan's response to the execution of his emissaries arrived. Some 900 ships and 40,000 men, a mixed force of Mongol warriors, Chinese infantry, and Korean sailors, obscured the waters around the islands of Tsushima and Iki. What transpired there was less a battle and more a massacre. The small contingents of local samurai fought with legendary bravery, but were wiped off the map. The invasion then moved to its main target, Hakata Bay in Kyushu. The Japanese samurai, proud and eager for glory, gathered on the beach. They had trained their entire lives for this moment, guided by a deeply ritualized code of war. For them, battle was a series of honorable duels. A warrior would advance on horseback, loudly proclaim his lineage and deeds, and challenge a similarly skilled opponent from the other side. It was a system based on individual honor and personal martial prowess. They had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. When the Mongol ships opened their doors, what disembarked was not individual warriors, but a single, impersonal entity. The Mongols advanced in close formations, protected by large shields, moving to the sound of drums and bronze bells. It was a disciplined and anonymous war machine. When a samurai advanced, shouting his name, expecting a duel, he was met not by a champion, but by a cloud of short, poised arrows, fired in coordinated volleys. And then the thunder came. The invaders began throwing small ceramic projectiles. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. They were TETSU, how iron bang bombs or clay pots filled with gunpowder and sometimes metal fragments. They weren't powerful enough to destroy formations, but their psychological impact was devastating. They exploded with a deafening flash and acrid smoke. Japanese horses, unaccustomed to the sound of explosions, reared up in panic, throwing their riders to the ground. The samurai, confused and terrified by what seemed to be black magic, broke formation. It was a cultural clash as violent as it was military. The Mongol group tactics crushed the individualism of the samurai. The Japanese, outnumbered and outmatched, were pushed inland, suffering terrible casualties. By nightfall, they had abandoned the beaches and retreated to an ancient inland fortress, Dezafu. The Battle of Bune was a complete humiliation. The Japanese warriors realized, within hours, that their way of life, their code of honor, and their war tactics were utterly useless against this alien enemy. They had faced the most advanced army on the planet, and they were broken. That November night, in 1274, the defeated samurai prepared for death. They awaited the final assault on their fortress at Dezafu at dawn. The day had been an absolute disaster. The coast was lost and morale was shattered, but the attack never came. When the sun rose, the Japanese looked towards Hakata Bay and saw nothing. The vast Mongol armada, the 900 ships that had covered the sea, had disappeared. What happened? This is one of the great questions of the first invasion. The most logical and widely accepted explanation is tactical and meteorological. The Mongols, although victorious on the beach, had also suffered casualties. Their supply lines were dangerously stretched across an unpredictable sea. More importantly, a storm was brewing. The experienced and cautious Korean sailors likely warned the Mongol generals about the danger of remaining. Anchored in an open bay with the wind shifting, the commanders prudently decided to return to their ships that night to regroup and avoid a desperate night attack by the Japanese. When the storm hit, it was stronger than expected, damaging hundreds of ships and forcing a complete retreat back to Korea. However, Japanese chronicles tell a different story, a tale of isolated heroism that may have changed the course of the war. This version, though unproven by Mongolian or Korean sources, has become a persistent legend. In it, during the height of the chaos at the Battle of Bune, as the Mongols advanced, a samurai named Shirishi Michiyasu is said to have managed to fire a remarkable arrow. The arrow is said to have pierced the chaos of battle and struck the Mongol commander, Lu Fuxiang or Holden, in the face, seriously wounding him. Historically, it is unlikely that a single injury to a subordinate commander would cause an entire army of 40,000 men to retreat. The Mongol army was famous for its resilient chain of command. However, the importance of the story lies not in its literal veracity, but in what it represents. For the Japanese, it was proof that the enemy, despite their bombs and impersonal tactics, could bleed. It gave a human face to the retreat. The likely truth is a combination of factors: casualties, stretched logistics, and most importantly, bad weather. The storm of 1274 wasn't the divine typhoon of 1281, but it was a clear warning that the ocean was a Japanese ally. For Kublai Khan, the expedition was a frustrating failure. For the Japanese, it was a miraculous respite. They knew with absolute certainty that the Khan was not a man to accept no from fate. He would return. And next time, he would come with full force. Japan had gained time, bought with blood, and saved by the wind. The shock of the Battle of Bunne was a brutal awakening. Hojo Tokimune and his generals understood the fundamental lesson of 1274. In open field, they could not win. The combination of Mongol formation tactics, their group discipline, and the psychological terror of their gunpowder bombs simply overwhelmed the individual valor of the samurai. The Mongol cavalry, if they could disembark and form lines on flat ground, would sweep away the Japanese forces. The solution, therefore, was to ensure that they could reach the level ground. Immediately after the Mongol retreat, the Kamakura shogunate initiated one of the most ambitious military engineering projects in Japanese history. The order was clear. The next battle would not be fought in open field, but on the tide. The strategy shifted from mobile defense to positional defense. Japan would build a wall. For the next 7 years, from 1274 to 1281, Hakata Bay was transformed into a vast construction site. The shogunate imposed a special tax on all large landowners, temples, nobles, and samurai clans in Kyushu. Each was required to provide a specific number of workers, stones, and supplies proportional to the size of their lands. It was a desperate national effort, directly overseen by the retainers of the Hojo clan. The result was Barui, the Mongol invasion wall. This was not a tall castle wall, as one might imagine. It was a long, low, and ingenious structure. About 2 to 3 meters high and 3 meters wide at its base, the wall stretched for 20 kilometers, embracing the entire coastline of the bay. Its seaward side was a steep slope, specifically designed to be a logistical nightmare. The wall served a twofold purpose. First, it physically prevented horses from disembarking. Mongol transport ships could not get close enough to the beach, and the horses would not be able to scale the slippery stone wall under enemy fire. Second, it broke up infantry formations. Mongol soldiers would have to disembark into the water, perhaps with the tide at their waists, and attempt to scale the wall one at a time, directly into the spears and swords of the samurai waiting for them at the top. The construction, Boru, represented a fundamental change in ethos Japanese warfare. The shogunate was forcing its warriors, raised in a tradition of individual glory, to fight shoulder to shoulder as a unified defensive infantry. The wall was an admission of tactical inferiority in open field, but also proof of intelligent strategic adaptation. Japan could no longer afford duels. Now, it was a matter of national survival. As the stones were laid, all of Japan held its breath, knowing that each day of work was one day less before the shadow on the horizon returned. While the stones Baruya's forces settled in Hakata Bay, a different and perhaps even more powerful mobilization was underway. 13th century Japan was governed from 2 capitals, each playing a distinct role in the crisis. In Kamakura, Regent Hojo Tokimune and his military shogunate were building walls, sharpening swords, and preparing for physical warfare. But in Kyoto, the imperial capital, the war took on an ethereal form. There resided Emperor Go-Yuta, a figure of limited political power but immense spiritual authority. He was considered the living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu Mikami, and, as such, was the high priest of the nation. The news of the brutality of the first invasion in 1274, and the certainty that the Khan would return, left no doubt. This was no ordinary war against a rival clan. It was an existential threat from an external barbaric world, an alien force that threatened to erase Japanese identity itself. In response, the imperial court did what it did best. It turned to the gods. The emperor ordered an unprecedented cycle of nationwide rituals and prayers. The imperial court sent messengers and donations to all major Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples across the country, with a single directive: to pray for the defeat of the Mongols and the safety of Japan. This was not a passive effort, it was a state policy. The Buddhist clergy were tasked with conducting continuous readings of sutras and exorcism rituals to subdue the enemy. The Shinto clergy, in turn, focused on appealing to ... We, the native spirits of Japan. The most solemn order was sent to the Grand Shrine of Eyes, the holiest site in Shintoism, dedicated to Amaterasu herself. The emperor himself wrote a calligraphic prayer, offering himself as a sacrifice, exchanging his life for the survival of his people, should the gods so demand. Copies of this prayer were dispatched throughout the country. The message was clear: the divine lineage was at stake. It was during this 7-year period of anxiety that an old idea was reinforced and revitalized: the belief that Japan Washinkoku, the land of the gods. The nation was not merely a piece of land. It was a divine creation, protected by a pantheon off-with it. They would not allow it to be desecrated by foreign invaders. This belief merged perfectly with military necessity. It gave the samurai preparing to fight on the wall a sense of cosmic purpose. They were not merely defending their lands or their lords. They were defending the sacred ground of the gods themselves. This spiritual mobilization had a profound psychological effect. It removed the option of surrender from the table. How could the land of the gods bow to an earthly Khan? Faith became armor. Japan was united not only by a stone wall, but by a wall of spiritual conviction. The war would be total, fought on both the physical and divine planes. In Beijing, his winter capital of Dadu, Kublai Khan was not satisfied. The failure of the 1274 expedition was a stain on his reign, a humiliation inflicted by a dwarf nation he barely considered worthy of note. The forced retreat, whether due to weather, logistics, or the legendary arrow, was unacceptable. The Japanese regent, Hojo Tokimune, had not only defied him, but made him look weak. And now, with news of the execution of his second emissaries in 1275, the offense had become intolerable. The second invasion would not be a punitive expedition, it would be annihilation. Over the next 7 years, Kublai Khan set in motion the largest war machine the world had ever seen. This time, he would not make the mistake of underestimating. He would mobilize the resources of his entire empire. The conquest of the southern Song dynasty in China in 1279 was the final piece of the puzzle. It not only eliminated his last great rival, but gave him full access to the shipyards, sailors, and resources of southern China, the naval heartland of the world at the time. The plan was colossal. The invasion would be launched with 2 massive fleets, which would meet at sea to form a single, unstoppable armada. The first was the Eastern Route Fleet. It was to be launched from Korea, which, as a vassal state, was again forced to bear a large part of the cost. This fleet consisted of about 900 ships carrying 40,000 men, a mixture of Mongol troops, northern Chinese troops, and a large Korean force. This was the diversionary force, intended to attack first and trap the Japanese defenders. The second, and truly overwhelming force, was the Southern Route Fleet. This would be assembled from the newly conquered ports of southern China. Its scale was almost incomprehensible: 3,500 ships, gigantic war junks, transport ships, support vessels. This fleet carried over 100,000 men. They were mostly soldiers of the recently defeated Southern Song dynasty, now conscripted to fight for their new Mongol overlords. Together, they formed the largest naval invasion force in human history up to D-Day in 1944. Nearly 4,500 ships and an army of 140,000 to 150,000 men. But this colossal force had weaknesses in its very foundation. Scale was a logistical problem, and there was the pressure. Kublai Khan was impatient. He wanted Japan subjugated. The orders to build, equip, and launch this armada were relentless. Here enters one of the most persistent and debated rumors in history. The naval carpenters and workers of southern China, who had bitterly fought the Mongols for decades, were now being forced to build the ships that would carry their conquerors to yet another victory. It is believed, and contemporary sources suggest, that silent sabotage was widespread. Green, uncured wood was allegedly used. Rivets were supposedly poorly placed, caulking carelessly done. Many of the ships in the Southern Fleet, though impressive in number, may have been fundamentally unsuitable for sailing, especially in turbulent ocean waters. They were colossal eggshells, built by men who secretly prayed for their failure. The Dragon Armada was the largest in the world, but perhaps also the most fragile. The armada of 140,000 men sailing toward Japan in 1281 was, on paper, an invincible force. In reality, it was a powder keg of ethnic tensions, rivalries, and questionable loyalties. Kublai Khan's army was not monolithically Mongol. The ethnic Mongols, the elite horsemen who had conquered the world, formed only the command corps, the backbone of officers and shock troops. They were a ruling minority within their own army. The bulk of the force was composed of a complex mix of subjugated peoples. From the Eastern Fleet based in Korea came thousands of Korean soldiers. Their kingdom, Guerrilla, had been a vassal state for decades, forced to provide not only ships and supplies, but also men. They fought out of obligation, not loyalty to the Khan. Alongside them were the northern Chinese and the Jurchens, peoples who had been integrated into the Mongol Empire generations before, but who still maintained their own identities. The situation in the Southern Fleet was even more volatile. The overwhelming majority of its 100,000 soldiers were Southern Chinese, men who, just a few years before, had been loyal citizens of the Song dynasty. They were the defeated army. Their nation had been annihilated, their leaders killed or captured. Now, they were conscripts, forced to wear the uniform of their conquerors and sent to die for an empire they despised. Their morale was, at best, fragile. Their loyalty was non-existent. For many, being captured by the Japanese might be no worse than serving the Mongols. This ethnic patchwork created a literal communication barrier. Mongols, Koreans, Northern Chinese speaking different dialects, and Southern Chinese speaking, still other dialects struggled to coordinate simple tactics. But the deeper divisions were hierarchical and cultural. Mongol generals, such as Allah Khan and Hanton, saw themselves as the undisputed masters. They treated their Chinese and Korean allies with disdain. The Chinese general Fan Wenhu, a deserter from the Song dynasty, commanded the Southern Fleet but was in a precarious political position, having to prove his loyalty to his Mongol masters while commanding men who saw him as a traitor. The Korean general Hong Dagu, though a capable commander, was caught between the brutal demands of the Mongols and the suffering of his own people. This divided command structure was a recipe for disaster. The two fleets were supposed to have departed together, but the Eastern Fleet left Korea in May, weeks earlier than planned, possibly in an attempt by Hong Dagu to claim the glory of victory before the Southern Fleet arrived. The Southern Fleet, in turn, was delayed by logistical problems and possibly by Fan Wenhu's hesitant command. This lack of coordination gave the Japanese a crucial advantage. Instead of facing a single, overwhelming armada, they were able to deal with the Eastern Fleet first, while the main army drifted aimlessly at sea, its internal tensions and disease festering under the summer heat. In late May 1281, Japanese lookouts positioned on the hills above Hakata Bay spent weeks scanning an empty horizon, a mixture of boredom and terror gnawing at their nerves. They knew the fleet would come. The only question was when. First came reports from the outer islands, Tsushima and Iki. Once again, as in 1274, the islands were subdued. But this time, the reports were of fiercer Japanese resistance and an even more brutal Mongol retaliation, since the invaders were taking no prisoners. The Eastern Fleet, with its 900 ships from Korea, was now in Japanese waters and had the bay as its target. Then, one morning in June, the sun rose, but it did not illuminate the sea. What the lookouts saw first were not ships. It was a dark blotch on the horizon, a line that looked like a low, ominous storm cloud. But as the morning wore on, the blotch did not dissipate. It grew. The cloud became a forest. What approached Hakata Bay was a sight so vast, so overwhelming that it defied comprehension. 900 ships, countless masts, square sails, and Mongol banners filled the horizon from end to end. The sea seemed to have vanished, replaced by a floating city of wood and war. For the samurai gathered behind their new stone wall, the Genk Baruthe sound must have been as terrifying as the sight. The wind carried the noise of thousands of voices screaming in unknown tongues, the sound of bronze gongs and the deep rumble of war drums, a rhythmic heartbeat for a monster of 40,000 men. The dread was palpable. It was a vision of the apocalypse. The Eastern Fleet, commanded by Hong Dagu and Kim Bangjiang, advanced with an arrogance born of their easy victory 7 years earlier. But something was different. The beach was not open. Waiting for them was a 20-kilometer-long line of rocks, and behind it, the glint of thousands of helmets and spearheads. And this was just the beginning. The Japanese didn't know it, but this was just the First Fleet. Much further south, still delayed by storms and logistics, the Southern Fleet, with its 100,000 men and 3,500 ships, was on its way. When it finally joined the First Fleet weeks later, the bay was so crowded with ships that it was said a person could walk miles from one deck to another without touching the water. The horizon disappeared completely. The sea was literally covered in sails. For the defenders, this was not a battle. It was a siege of the world itself. How could they, a handful of warriors on an island, withstand the totality of Kublai Khan's power? What followed was one of the strangest and most tense standoffs in military history. A story of this magnitude, where reality surpasses fiction, shows us how the fate of a nation can depend on courage against impossible odds. That's why we love uncovering these moments. If this epic narrative is captivating you and you believe these stories deserve to be told, leave your comment. Like to give us strength, your like is more than just a click. It's a sign that you value in-depth historical knowledge. And if you're not already part of our community, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. But by doing so, you'll not only avoid missing the next chapter of this and other incredible sagas, but you'll also help build a platform dedicated to exploring the past without filters. We want to know your opinion. What other story that seems straight out of a movie would you like to see dissected here? Let us also know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's fascinating for us to see how far this passion for history travels. Now, let's return to the standoff at Hakata, where the world's largest fleet discovered that victory wouldn't be so easy after all. The Mongol army was fundamentally a cavalry army. Their warfare doctrine, perfected on the vast steppes of Asia, relied on speed, shock, and the overwhelming power of their mounted archers. They conquered on land. The sea was merely an inconvenience, a ditch to be crossed to bring their horses into battle. In 1274, the landing was relatively easy, and they proved that, in open terrain, their horses and tactics were superior. Now, in 1281, they hoped to repeat the feat. The Eastern Fleet anchored and prepared for landing. Flat-bottomed ships were loaded with soldiers and horses, and they rowed towards the beach. But the scene they found was unrecognizable. The Gank Baruv, everything changed. The stone wall, 2 to 3 meters high, ran along the entire beach at high tide. It didn't look as imposing as a castle, but its genius lay in its simplicity. Landing ships couldn't reach the dry sand. They would run aground in the water, still some distance from the wall. Horses, if disembarked, would have to swim and then find a way to climb a wet, slippery stone wall, all while being targeted by hundreds of samurai archers. The cavalry, the main Mongol weapon, was neutralized before it even touched down on land. The infantry remained, but for them, the challenge was equally deadly. The Mongol and Korean soldiers had to jump from their boats into chest-deep water and advance slowly against the current, holding their weapons and shields above their heads. They were easy targets for Japanese archers positioned atop the wall. Those who survived the hail of arrows reached the base of the wall exhausted, only to find a stone barrier. They had to drop their shields and attempt to climb, one man at a time. At the top, the samurai waited. This was a war they understood. It wasn't an open, chaotic battlefield. It was a choke-point defense. They could use their Naginata spears with curved blades and with straight spears to push the climbers back to the sea. If an invader managed to reach the top, he was met not by an army, but by a concentrated duel where the samurai's skill with the katana was supreme. The invaders tried repeatedly at different points along the bay. Each attempt was a massacre. They landed on a narrow beach called Shiga, but were quickly surrounded and annihilated by mobile samurai forces. The wall turned the Mongol tactical advantage into a deadly trap. It broke their formations, denied them their cavalry, and forced them to fight in small groups, a scenario where the individualistic samurai thrived. After days of bloody and futile attempts, the Mongol generals realized the devastating truth. They could not land at Hakata. The stone wall had won. Eastern Fleet retreated to its ships, humiliated. When the Southern Fleet, with its 100,000 men, finally arrived to join them, all they did was add another 3,500 ships to an already established stalemate. The largest armada in history was now anchored, a few meters from the beach, but without any way to bring its power ashore. They became the largest concentration of static targets the world had ever seen, turning their own warships into floating prisons. The stalemate in Hakata Bay stretched from days to weeks. For the Japanese on the beach, it was a tense wait. For the more than 140,000 men crammed onto the ships of the Mongol fleet, it became a floating hell. The scale of the operation was now their greatest enemy. Imagine 4,400 ships, many of them hastily built from uncured green wood, rocking incessantly in the humid heat of the Japanese summer. The ships were crammed together, every inch of space occupied by men, horses, and supplies. The steppe horses, unaccustomed to the sea, fell ill and died, their bodies thrown overboard, polluting the very water where the fleet was anchored. The logistics system, which the Mongols had mastered on land, collapsed at sea. Supplies of fresh water stored in barrels quickly ran out or became contaminated. Food, mainly dried grain and salted meat, began to rot in the dampness. The men were hungry, thirsty, and above all, sick. Sanitation was non-existent. The waste from 140,000 men was simply dumped into the sea, into the same water where, out of desperation, some tried to fish. The suffocating heat transformed the ship's holds into incubators of disease. Dysentery was the first to strike, spreading like wildfire. The men, weakened by the lack of food and drinking water, died by the thousands. Typhus and perhaps even cholera followed. It is estimated that, at the height of the siege, hundreds of men died every day of illness. For the southern Chinese soldiers who made up the bulk of the southern fleet, the situation was even worse. They were the conscripted troops, the defeated, and were treated as such by their Mongol overlords. They received the worst rations, the worst accommodations, and the greatest contempt. Their morale, already low, disintegrated. They had no loyalty to Kublai Khan. They were there against their will, dying of disease for an empire that had destroyed their own. Apathy turned to despair and possibly latent resentment, waiting for an opportunity. The generals, entrenched in their flagships, argued. The lack of coordination that had hampered the start of the invasion now paralyzed their command. The generals of the Eastern Fleet, who had been defeated by the Wall, blamed those of the Southern Fleet for their delay. The generals of the Southern Fleet, in turn, saw no reason to waste their men on futile assaults against such a well-prepared defense. The army was rotting from the inside out, dying of disease and demoralization, all within sight of the land they had come to conquer. The largest armada in the world was paralyzed, not by battle, but by its own weight and its inability to move. To understand what happened next in the darkness of Hakata Bay, one must first understand the mind of the man holding the awe. The anchored and ailing Mongol army saw before it a stone wall, a unified defense. But what they could not see was that behind that wall there was no army in the sense they understood it. Instead, there were thousands of individuals in conflict, a collection of clans and warriors bound by an oath, but driven by desperate personal ambition. Japan's greatest weakness, and paradoxically, its greatest strength, was the 13th century samurai code. This was not the Bushido from later centuries, the philosophical Neo-Confucian and romantic path of the Edo period, which spoke of selfless duty and a serene death. The Kamakura warrior code was a much more primitive, pragmatic, and brutal creature. It was a feudal system based on a direct and visceral exchange, loyalty for reward. The Kamakura shogunate was founded on this premise. The warriors Gokinen swore loyalty to the shogun in exchange for the guarantee of their land's G2 and the promise of more if they served well. For them, war was the main form of social mobility. But to claim a reward, a samurai needed proof. His bravery had to be demonstrated vista, registered, and presented to an officer. In all previous wars in Japan, which had been civil wars, this was simple. The battles often began with a ritual Kalyad no Nori, where a samurai would charge on horseback shouting his name, his lineage, and his deeds, challenging an opponent of equal status. It was as much a performance as a combat. The objective was to defeat a recognizable enemy, to take his head shirushi as proof and present it to his lord in exchange for lands and titles that would be confiscated of the defeated enemy. The Mongol invasion broke this system in two ways. First, as they discovered in 1274, the enemy wasn't interested in duels. A samurai shouting his name was simply met with a volley of arrows from anonymous infantry. Second, and more crucially, this was a defensive war against an external enemy. Even if they won, what lands would there be to take? The Mongols didn't own property in Japan to redistribute. The shogunate was asking its warriors to fight and die for the first time for an abstract concept of nation, but the reward system that guaranteed their loyalty had no way to pay them. Now, in 1281, The situation was a financial and career nightmare for the samurai. He was there, out of obligation, behind a wall, spending his own fortune to feed his men and horses, and watching his wealth dwindle with each passing day of stalemate. Being on the wall was infantry work, anonymous, and without glory. How could he prove his worth? How could he distinguish himself from the thousands of other men who were also there? The frustration of these proud and individualistic warriors was immense. The stalemate was not just a military wait, it was a purgatory of irrelevance. They were desperate for action, for any opportunity to create visible merit that they could one day take to Kamakura and demand their pay. This individualistic mentality, this hunger for personal glory, made them terrible garrison soldiers. But it would create the most dangerous naval guerrilla warriors the world had ever seen. The Walganka Baruit had been a brilliant tactical success, but it had also created a strategic problem. The landing had been prevented, but the war had not been won. The gigantic Mongol fleet, despite disease and demoralization, was going nowhere. The stalemate was depleting Japanese resources almost as quickly as those of the invaders. The samurai, huddled behind their wall, felt their frustration turning into something dangerous. Passive defense was not their way of life. Japanese commanders like Shiny Kagesuk realized that time, while killing the enemy, also killed their own war economy. A decision had to be made. A direct naval assault against 4,400 ships was suicide. The invading army could not be defeated by brute force. It had to be defeated psychologically. The order was given. It was time to abandon the defense and begin the counterattack. The strategy born from this desperation was the Yochi ... the night attack. If the enemy ships were mountains, the Japanese would use their weakness, asymmetry. Japan didn't have war junks. What it had were hundreds of ... Kobayashi, small, light, and incredibly maneuverable coastal boats. They were essentially fishing and transport boats, not warships, propelled not by noisy Western oars, but by the Japanese polo row, which allowed for almost silent movement through the water. Instead of engaging the fleet in battle, they would hunt it down in the dark. The name given to this tactic, kwasarigama, while it may not literally refer to the use of the peasant weapon of chain and sickle, is a perfect metaphor for the strategy. The plan was to use the chain, the grappling hook, or don, to latch onto the giant enemy and, once bound, use the scythe, the katana, and the dagger to mow down its crews. The attack plan was brutal and multifaceted. First, the silent approach. The kobaya boats, with their oars wrapped in rags to muffle the sound, would glide under the cloak of darkness, navigating the currents known only to the locals, towards the colossal anchored Mongolian ships. Second, the approach. Samurai would use grappling hooks kaganawa to attach themselves to these solid wooden hulls. The height of the giant reeds was a defense, but it also created enormous blind spots. Third, chaos. Once aboard, the objective wasn't to capture the ship, but to create as much panic and damage as possible in the shortest amount of time. Kill sentries, cut the enormous rudder and anchor cables, and most importantly, set fires. Fire was the ultimate terror on a sea of overcrowded wooden ships. Small groups of samurai trained as arsonists would carry pitch and torches. Fourth, psychological warfare. Samurai would use their mimpo face masks, mini-designed to resemble demons oni, and unleash wild war cries in the middle of the night to terrorize crews, many of whom already believed Japan was a land of spirits. Fifth, and most crucial for the samurai themselves, was the collection of evidence. Every attack was an opportunity to take heads. This decision marked a fundamental turning point in the war. Japan ceased to be the besieged victim and became the nocturnal predator. It was an admission that they could not win a conventional battle and a declaration that for that very reason, they would wage a completely unconventional war. History is often told of kings and generals. We rarely hear the voice of the soldier on the ground. But in the Mongol invasion of Japan, we have something unique. A first-person visual account, commissioned not by a historian but by a common soldier desperate for recognition. Our protagonist is not a great feudal lord, but Agokenian vassal of low rank from the province of Higo, an impetuous, proud, and perpetually indebted man named Takazaki Suinaga. We owe our intimate understanding of this war to him, and specifically to his frustration. In 1293, more than a decade after the war, Suinaga, feeling that his heroic deeds were being forgotten and, crucially, that he had not been sufficiently rewarded, commissioned the Muko Shrai Iko Toba, the illustrated scrolls of the Mongol invasion. These scrolls are not an objective history. They are a petition. They are a visual resume, a glorified expense report that Suinaga personally took to Kamakura to prove his worth and demand his payment. And because of Suinaga's vanity and pragmatism, we have an unparalleled glimpse into the reality of war. Suinaga was the perfect embodiment of primitive Bushido Topic 13. He already had a reputation for reckless bravery. In the scrolls, he proudly details how, during the invasion of 1274, his commander ordered the troops to stand firm. Suinaga, seeing another clan advance and fearing they would receive all the glory, disobeyed a direct order. Shouting that advance and die for the emperor is the warrior's way, he led his 5 men in a solitary attack against the Mongol line, being immediately defeated, wounded, and nearly killed. He did not do this out of patriotism. He did it to Bevu. After 1274, he spent what little he had on an expensive trip to Kamakura to present his case, showing Mongol arrowheads as proof. He secured a hearing and received a horse and a small fief as a reward. Now, in 1281, he was back, and the stalemate at Hakata Bay was his worst nightmare. He was in full armor, with his men and horses, spending his own money, and nothing was happening. Nothing. His financial ruin was drawing near. When the Japanese commanders announced the new tactic of Fyo Shirerding, the night guerrilla attacks Topic 14, most samurai might have viewed this as a dangerous duty or a suicide mission. Takazaki Suinaga saw it as a business opportunity. It was his last, desperate chance to achieve the individual glory that eluded him, to secure the undeniable trophies enemy heads that would finally guarantee him the reward he so desperately believed he deserved. It was with this mindset, a mixture of courage, desperation, and financial calculation, that Suinaga volunteered to be one of the first to row into the nightmare of the Black Fleet. The decision to counterattack to launch the naval guerrilla warfare known Asiakiat was a strategic turning point, but for the individual samurai, it was an existential turning point. Honor, tactics, and the very identity of the warrior had to be set aside in favor of something new, something desperate and terribly practical. The stone wall had failed to bring them glory. Now, the sea offered one last chance. When commanders like Shiny Kagesuk asked for volunteers for the first night raids, it wasn't the great generals or the wealthy landowners who came forward. It was men like Takezaki Suinaga. It was Thigo Kanonov, low rank, the indebted, the ambitious, the reckless. These were the men who had more to gain from a Mongoloid head than to lose from death itself. It was from this group of desperate men that the first elite forces were formed. The number recorded in the legend, 80 men, should not be understood as the total number of combatants, but rather as the model for a single attack unit. A group of 80 to 100 men, divided into 8 or 10 small boats. Kobayashi. This was the ideal force, small enough to be stealthy, but large enough to cause significant chaos when aboard an enemy ship. And these 80 men had to make a decision that went against everything they had been taught as samurai. They had to abandon their armor. The traditional armor of the Kamakura samurai was Theo Yoroith. Great armor was a work of art, iron boxes and lacquered leather, bound with thousands of colorful silk cords. It was magnificent, intimidating, and designed for a single purpose: mounted archery. It protected the rider from arrows while he rode. But at sea, in a small boat, or trying to climb the hull of a ship, Theo Yoroit was a death sentence. It was heavy, clumsy, and incredibly noisy. A man who fell into the water with it would sink like a stone. Thus, the volunteers for the suicide mission did something radical. They stripped themselves of their identity. They removed their heavy armor. In its place, they wore the bare minimum. Some may have worn a dumarua, a lighter, tighter-fitting chest armor, worn by infantry soldiers, allowed for much greater mobility. Many, as is likely, may have gone simply with their light cotton clothing, a fundoshi sex cover, and maybe a hachimaki, a headband to keep sweat and hair out of their eyes. They traded protection for agility. They traded the identity of noble knight for that of infiltrator. They were admitting that if they were caught before boarding, they would die anyway. Their only option was not to be seen. This decision transformed them from soldiers into assassins, a mental shift as important as the tactical one. The darkness in Hakata Bay became Japan's new weapon. But darkness alone was not enough. The Mongol fleet was a floating city, and like a city, it had lookouts. There were lanterns on the masts and patrols on the decks. The challenge was not only to cross the water, but to do so in a way that was both audibly and visually undetectable. To achieve this, the Japanese had two crucial advantages: their equipment and their local knowledge. First, the equipment. Their small boats, Kobayashi, they were lightweight and had a shallow draft, which allowed them to glide over shallow waters that Mongolian boats could not reach. But their true secret weapon was the Japanese pole oar, Theroin-like Western or Chinese oars, which are used in pairs and move in and out of the water, creating a splash and creaking sound. Theroit is a single paddle used at the stern. The operator moves it from side to side in a sculling motion, underneath water. The result is a nearly completely silent means of propulsion. The only sound is a soft gurgling shesh of the water to be displaced. For any auxiliary oars needed for maneuvering, the samurai took extreme precautions. They wrapped the oar shafts in waraji, their own straw sandals, or cotton rags to muffle any sound of wood hitting against wood. Secondly, local knowledge. The Mongols were men of the steppes, and the northern Chinese were men of the rivers. They were foreigners in that ocean. But the Japanese warriors, especially those from coastal clans like the Matsurura, had been born in that bay. They knew every current, every sandbar, every peculiarity of the tide. They didn't row against the tide, they used it. Raids were launched with the rising tide, which helped to effortlessly carry their boats toward the anchored fleet. They waited for moonless nights, when the sky was darkest. They prayed for fog, which often formed over the bay in summer, providing perfect cover. The journey from the beach to the hull of the first Mongol ship was perhaps the most terrifying part of the mission. It could take an hour more. An hour of silent, disciplined rowing. An hour of absolute tension where a single mistake in R falling, a careless cough, a glint of reflected metal would mean a hail of arrows and death in the cold water. The samurai, stripped of their armor, sat in their small boats, rowing silently into the mouth of hell, listening to the sounds of the enemy fleet, a sentry shouting in a foreign tongue, the sickly neighing of a horse growing ever louder in the darkness, the soft sound of wood hitting wood. The boat, Kobayashi, he had arrived. He had slipped through the darkness, past any patrol boats, and now stood directly under the shadow of one of the gigantic Mongol war junks. The sound of the awe stopped. This was the moment of greatest vulnerability. From the water's surface, the enemy ship didn't look like a ship. It looked like a cliff. The hull of a large Chinese war junk rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 meters out of the water. It was a wall of solid wood, often slippery due to seawater and silt. Looking up, the samurai could see the faint glow of a lantern on the deck high above their heads. This was where light armor, or the lack thereof, proved its worth. A man in heavy armor, Oyuroi, could never even attempt this feat, the first man in each boat. The most agile would grab onto done. This was the grappling hook, an essential climbing tool for the samurai, used as much for capturing castles as for seizing ships. It was a 3- or 4-pronged iron hook attached to a long, strong rope. The success of the entire mission depended on that first throw. Silently, the samurai spun the hook and threw it upwards. He couldn't make a sound. If the hook struck the hull, the sound would echo. If the throw was too short, it would crash back down onto the boat with a bang. It had to be a perfect throw, over the ship's railing, so that the hook would firmly grip the deck or handrail. There was a terrifying second of silence. The man pulled the rope gently. She was trapped. Now, the ascent began. One by one, the samurai gripped the rope. This was no easy climb. The rope was wet and slippery. The ship's hull was bent, forcing them to climb almost upside down in some places. They climbed in absolute silence, with their daggers' tantathir belts were fastened, and their katanas were strapped to their backs. The effort was immense. Their arms and shoulders burned from the strain. They were completely exposed. If a Mongol sentry looked down at that exact moment, a single archer could kill several men on the rope. A dropped stone, a jar of boiling oil, and the mission would be over. It was a supreme test of strength, stealth, and courage. The first man to reach the top was the most crucial. He had to reach over the parapet, stand up, and roll onto the deck without making a sound. He was now a ghost in enemy territory, and had only a few seconds to neutralize the nearest sentry before she could raise the alarm. While his compatriots climbed the rope right behind him, the infiltration was complete. The terror on deck was about to begin. The first samurai to roll over the Mongol ship's railing landed in a silent crouch. His world was reduced to the dark deck and the silhouette of the nearest sentry. This first death had to be silent. It was not the time for katana. It was time for Tiantomber. The Mongol guard could process the moving shadow. The samurai closed the distance. One hand covered his mouth. The other buried the dagger beneath his leather helmet at the base of his skull. The body was supported and lowered to the ground without a sound. Almost simultaneously, the rest of the group climbed the ropes, spilling over the railing like spiders. 8, 10, 12 men. Now silence was a lost option. One of the men tripped on a cable on the dark deck. The metallic sound of his short sword striking an iron ring echoed in the night. An alarm cry rang out from elsewhere on the ship. Enemies. Enemies on board. All hell broke loose. The deck of the Mongol junk, until then an overcrowded dormitory, had become a confined slaughterhouse. Mongol and Chinese soldiers, awakened from a sickly sleep, emerged from makeshift shelters, grabbing the nearest weapons. But these were the wrong weapons. The Mongols were masters of the composite bow in open fields and the long spear in infantry formation. On the deck of a crowded ship, in the darkness, these weapons were worse than useless. Their 3-meter spears were too long. The tips struck the masts and rigging, and the men behind them pushed, creating a deadly traffic jam. Their famous bows lacked the range to fire. It was a knife fight in a telephone booth, and the samurai had brought the perfect knives. At this moment, the katana proved to be the queen of close combat weapons. The samurai didn't need space for a thrust. He didn't need leverage for a powerful blow. Katana was designed for cutting. With its unique curve and razor-sharp edge, it was an extension of the warrior's body. In a fluid pulling motion, straight from the sheath, a single samurai could sever an arm, split open a torso, or sever a limb before the enemy soldier, still half asleep, could even raise his spear. The samurai did not fight in formation. Each was a vortex of individual violence, a master of his own art. They moved through the chaos, their light armor giving them a speed that the Mongol soldiers, in heavier lamellar or leather armor, could not match. The deck became a cacophony of shouts in 3 languages. The religious teacher, the sharp sound of the samurai piercing the air, the smell of fresh blood mingling with the stench of disease. Topic 12. The Mongols' numerical superiority was irrelevant. On a ship that housed 500 men, only 20 could fight at a time in the embarkation area, and those 20 were being systematically slaughtered by 12 warriors, who had trained their entire lives for this exact type of brutal, one-on-one combat. What happened on those decks was more than a battle. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The samurai weren't just killing men, they were killing the morale of an empire. Many of the Japanese warriors who boarded those ships wore MPO. Their war face masks. These masks, forged from lacquered iron, served not only a protective function. They were designed to be the embodiment of terror. They featured bared teeth, boar tusks, ferocious mustaches, and the distorted features of demons from Japanese mythology. They and the leave. Now imagine the scene from the perspective of a Chinese conscript soldier. He was already ill, languishing for weeks on an overcrowded ship. Topic 12. Anchored off the coast of an island he was told was the land of the gods. Shinkoku. Topic 7. A place protected by spiritual forces. He is awakened from his feverish sleep by screams. In the darkness he sees a figure, faster than any man he has ever seen, slaughtering his comrades. The flickering light of a torch illuminates the attacker's face, and it is not a human face. It is a metal demon with fangs, furious eyes, and a cry that sounds like that of a hawk. This was not a soldier fighting another soldier. He was a superstitious peasant confronting a demon that had emerged from the depths of the ocean to drag him to hell. The samurai cultivated this fear. They used "Thirreligious Teacher." His battle cry. This was no mere cry of rage. It was a disciplined vocal technique, an explosion of spirit and sound designed to shock the opponent's nervous system, paralyzing them for a fraction of a second. In the chaos of the deck, these high-pitched, otherworldly cries seemed to be the very cries of the spirits of the sea. Kublai Khan's army, composed of multiple nationalities. Topic 9, was already divided and demoralized. The southern Chinese soldiers lacked loyalty to the cause. Their will to fight was fragile. This night demon tactic completely broke it. Panic was a disease even faster than dysentery. The soldiers didn't try to fight, they tried to flee. They jumped over each other to get away from the attackers, some even throwing themselves into the sea, preferring certain drowning to facing the blades of those phantoms. This combination of elite combat and psychological terror is fascinating, and it's precisely the kind of deep detail that transforms a good story into an epic one. If you agree, and this raw vision of samurai warfare surprises you, support our channel with a ... help us continue to delve deeper into these incredible narratives. With each successful attack, the legend grew. The 80 samurai were not men. They were agents of divine vengeance. The Mongol fleet, the largest in the world, was being terrorized one ship at a time by a handful of demons. The samurai assault party knew they had a very limited window of time. The brutal combat on deck was only the first phase, the distraction. The real strategic objective was not to kill 100 men. It was to destroy a 1,000-ton ship and create panic that would spread throughout the fleet. While the main battle raged near the bulwark, a small detachment of the assault group, perhaps only 4 or 5 men who had trained specifically for this, broke away. They did not engage in the fighting. They ignored the Mongol soldiers rushing towards them, letting their comrades intercept them. Their objective was the heart of the ship, the mainmast and the sails. These men carried bundles of pitch-soaked wood, oiled rags, and torches. They rushed through the chaos, protected by their companions, toward the base of the mainmast. The gigantic sails of the junk were furled, but they were made of heavy canvas, often treated with tar to waterproof them. The thick rigging that ran up the mast, controlling the sails and the ship's stability, was similarly covered in tar. They were, essentially, giant fuses. The samurai set their charges on fire and threw them onto the tethered sails and bundles of ropes. The ignition was almost instantaneous. The tarred ropes caught fire with a whoosh. Flame shot up the mast in seconds, like a fiery serpent climbing towards the night sky. The dry, oiled sails exploded in a wall of flames. The effect was immediate and devastating. First, the light. Night turned into day. The deck, previously dark, was suddenly illuminated by a sinister orange light, revealing the utter carnage the samurai had inflicted. The Mongol soldiers, momentarily blinded, screamed in terror. Second, chaos. The ship was now burning uncontrollably. The only priority for the hundreds of men on board was no longer fighting the invaders. It was putting out the fire or abandoning ship. Panic became absolute. Third, the signal. For the other ships in the Mongol fleet, a ship in their midst bursting into flames was the ultimate alarm signal. It created panic and confusion, forcing them to concentrate on saving their own ships from the sparks, rather than pursuing the attackers. This was the cue for the samurai's escape. With their strategic objective achieved and the deck now a blazing inferno, the group's leader shouted the order to retreat. Fighting as a unit, they retreated to the boarding point, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. One by one, they leaped over the railing, clinging to their own boarding ropes or simply dropping the 5 or 6 meters to their side. Kobayashiwo was waiting below. The last man cut the rope from the hook. The Arroit entered the water, and with its silent movement, the small boat disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a pillar of fire, screams, and the sound of cracking wood. The mission was complete. While the shadows of the night belonged to the Guerrilla Squad Zyuchi, Topic 17. Daylight was the undisputed domain of the Mongol fleet. Under the sun, the archers and catapults of the armada could see anyone approaching, and the idea of an attack was considered pure suicide. It was precisely for this reason that one man decided to do it. If night raids were acts of strategic stealth, Kono Mishiari's attack was an act of pure, reckless samurai bravery, a performance so audacious that it became almost mythical. Kono Mishiari era Gokonin vassal of Iyo province. Like Takezuki Swanaga Topic 15, he was a man consumed by the need to prove his worth and obtain the glory that would bring him rewards. Seeing night raids becoming commonplace, Michiari apparently decided that the only way to truly stand out was to do the impossible. Ignoring all advice to the contrary, he manned only 2 small boats, Kobayashi's his most loyal retainers. And then, in broad daylight, he rowed directly into the heart of the Mongol fleet. The scene must have been surreal. The Mongols, aboard their gigantic ships, must have seen the 2 tiny boats approaching and assumed it was an attempt at surrender or a delegation. The fleet's arrogance was their only cover. When the boats came dangerously close, their true intentions became clear. A hail of arrows and projectiles rained down upon them, but Michiari and his men rode through it, a testament to their determination or their madness. They managed to reach the hull of a large junk that appeared to be a command ship. They deployed their boarding hooks, then they began their ascent, not under cover of darkness, but under direct fire. It was chaos. Several of their men fell, but Kono Michiari, in a feat of legendary strength and fury, managed to reach the deck. What followed was a desperate battle, not an infiltration. Michiari and his small band against an entire deck of enemy soldiers. But their ferocity, the sheer audacity of their attack, seems to have shocked the defenders. Legend says that Michiari fought like a demon, cutting his way through the guards until he identified a high-ranking officer. In a feat of incredible strength, he didn't kill the general right there. He subdued him, fought to drag him back to the bulwark, and somehow managed to throw the captured commander onto his boat. He then retreated, still under intense fire, and rowed back to Hakata Beach. He presented the Mongol general alive to the Japanese commanders. The officer was, undoubtedly, interrogated, providing crucial information about demoralization, disease, and internal tensions in the fleet topics 12 and 9. Once his usefulness was exhausted, the general was executed. Kono Michiari took the head as his own, Shirushi the ultimate proof of merit. Almost every aspect of this story seems exaggerated, and historians debate its veracity. But, in a sense, it doesn't matter if it happened exactly as it was told. History. Kono Michiari became an instant legend among Japanese defenders. He was the ultimate embodiment of the samurai ideal, a single warrior. Through his own courage, humbling the invincible enemy, and bringing home the ultimate trophy, all under the sunlight. He was moral drive in its purest form. If Kono Michiari's attack was the thunderbolt that shocked the fleet, the night Ataxiuchit was the relentless acid rain that corroded it from within. The cumulative effect of these incursions night after night went far beyond the casualties inflicted or the ships burned. The true target was the mind of the Mongol command. For Generals Ala Khan, Hongdagu, and Fan Wenhu, life had become a nightmare of sleep deprivation. Every shadow on deck, every sound of water splashing in the darkness, every sentry's cry was a potential attack by Demons. The closing parenthesis emerging from the sea topic 20. The sentinels were doubled, then tripled. The troops, already weakened by dysentery and hunger topic 12, were forced to remain on watch in long shifts, staring into a darkness that seemed alive. Rest became impossible. This physical and mental exhaustion had a paralyzing effect on strategy. How could the generals plan a new landing attempt elsewhere? How could they organize a tactical retreat or regrouping? The chain of command was being systematically dismantled. Their days were spent dealing with the aftermath of the previous night's attack, counting the dead, extinguishing fires topic 21, redeploying troops from damaged ships. Their nights were spent waiting, exhausted and terrified, for the next attack. The greatest war machine on the planet was paralyzed, reduced to a purely defensive posture, trapped in a limbo of terror. Worse than fear, however, was suspicion. The attacks were too precise. The Japanese seemed to know exactly which ships to hit, where the sentries were weakest, how to avoid the patrols. To the Mongol mind, hierarchical and disciplined, this effectiveness could not be mere luck. There had to be inside help. The eyes of the Mongol officials inevitably turned to the weakest link in their own chain, the conscripted soldiers of the Southern Song dynasty. These men, who made up the majority of the Southern Fleet topic 9, were already despised and mistreated. They had every reason to hate their Mongol conquerors. And now, they were being accused of treason. Paranoia began. A Chinese soldier seen gazing at the shore for too long was a potential signal. A Chinese navigator suggesting anchoring elsewhere was trying to lead the ship into a trap. The fleet's cohesion, already fragile due to ethnic divisions, disintegrated. The Mongols began executing their own Chinese soldiers on the slightest suspicion. Kublai Khan's fleet was devouring itself. Trust, the currency of any army, had vanished, and the samurai, silently rowing in their small boats, had been the thieves. Desperate for a solution, tormented by night attacks topics 19 to 21, humiliated by day attacks topic 22, and consumed by paranoia topic 23, the Mongol commanders made a decision. If they couldn't stop the small boats, Kobayashi, if they could penetrate their lines, then there would be no lines left to penetrate. They would transform their 4,000 individual ships into a single, impenetrable, floating fortress. The order was given to move the combined fleet to Amari Bay, and there, implement a classic defensive tactic, chaining the ships to each other. The logic for a land army seemed flawless. Carpenters and blacksmiths worked frantically, connecting the enormous war junks with heavy iron chains and laying long wooden planks between the decks. The result was a vast platform, a great wall in the sea. This tactic solved several problems at once. First, it made the Sayaki Afrik is almost impossible. A boat Kobayashi, no longer could they silently slide onto the hull of an individual ship. Instead, they encountered a solid wall of chained hulls. Secondly, it created a stable battlefield. Soldiers could finally form ranks on the linked decks, allowing them to use their long spears and group tactics, negating the advantage of Katana. Topic 19. Third, it allowed the mounting of catapults and gillnets on larger ships, creating defensive artillery batteries. It seemed to be the perfect strategic solution. However, this was the decision that sealed their fate. It was the fatal mistake of a land army attempting to wage a naval war. The tactic of chaining ships was known, but it was a tactic, Bluvial. It had been used successfully on large rivers, such as the Yangtze, where the water is calm and flat. The Mongol generals and their Chinese advisors like Fan Winhu were applying the logic of river warfare to the most unforgiving and unpredictable environment on the planet, the Pacific Ocean. A ship on the open sea needs to be agile. It needs the ability to roll, to turn to face the waves, to rise and fall with the swell. Individual buoyancy is its only defense against the power of the ocean. By chaining thousands of ships together, the Mongols removed that defense. They created a rigid and inflexible structure. Each ship was no longer fighting the sea. It was fighting the ship next to it. They had built the world's largest trap and had voluntarily locked themselves inside it. Their floating fortress was a collective eggshell. Now all it took to break the largest armada in history was a little wind. And at the end of summer, in that part of the world, the wind was arriving. It was mid-August 1281. For almost 2 months, the Mongol fleet had been stuck in its stalemate. First by the Wall Genko Barue, topic Shiyi, then by their own demoralization, topic 12, and by the terror of the attacks, Yochi, topic 19. Now they were chained to each other in Amari Bay, in a defensive fortress that was also a deadly trap, topic 24. The samurai, seeing their new tactic thwarted by the chains, retreated to the shore and waited. Their frustration along with that of the Mongols. All of Japan held its breath. Then nature gave its warning. For the seasoned sailors of the Southern Fleet, men from southern China, veterans of monsoons and coastal storms, the signs began subtly. First, the wind stopped. After weeks of humid, oppressive heat, the air suddenly became still, dense, and heavy. The air smelled of salt and something else, an electric odor, like ozone. Then came the sea. The ocean, which never rests, became strangely calm. The waves that had incessantly battered the hulls of the ships softened, transforming into a long, oily, slow ripple. It was not a calm sea, it was a sick sea. The water seemed to be being sucked back in a prelude to a deep sigh. And finally, the sky. At sunset, the western sky didn't blaze with its usual oranges and reds. Instead, it took on a sickly color, a yellowish green and grayish hue, almost metallic. High, thin clouds, like the fingers of a skeleton, began to form in the sky, all pointing towards an invisible center on the horizon. The atmospheric pressure, which the sailors felt in their ears and joints, was plummeting. On the fleet's decks, the Chinese and Korean sailors looked at each other with a terror that bore no resemblance to the samurai. They knew these signs. This was the dragon's breath. This was the typhoon season. They pleaded with their officers. They rushed to their ship commanders, gesturing to the sky, to the sea, to the terrifying stillness. Their message was universal and desperate. We must go out to sea, far from the coast. We must cast off the chains and give the ships room to dance with the storm. To remain anchored and worse, chained, was suicide. But their warnings fell on deaf ears. The supreme commanders were Mongol generals. They were men of the steppe. Their world was the land, the horses, the dry plains. To them, the ocean was an abstraction, an obstacle, not a living enemy. What did they know about the color of the sky or the texture of the water? They saw the calm, not as a warning, but as a relief. They saw their chained fortress as their greatest tactical achievement, to undo their work, release the ships, and scatter their invincible fleet because of the weather. Inconceivable. The arrogance and ignorance of the steppes sealed their fate. They gave the order to maintain formation. That night, the stillness became absolute. The silence was so profound that one could hear the creak of a single cable. And then, on the distant horizon, the first thunder murmured. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the storm itself, still hundreds of kilometers away, shifting the air. The typhoon had a name. The Japanese called it Raijin, the god of thunder, and it was on its way. The storm didn't arrive. It exploded. The stillness of the night was shattered by a gust of wind so violent it sounded like a solid roar. It was the first blow of an invisible fist. The wind didn't blow from one direction. It seemed to come from all directions at once. A howling vortex that ripped banners from masts and threw men from decks before they could even realize what was happening. Almost immediately, the rain began. It wasn't rain. It was a horizontal deluge. Blades of water shot out with the force of musket balls, whipping exposed skin and blinding everyone on deck. And with the rain came thunder and lightning, not as separate events, but as a continuous bombardment. The sky became a convulsion of strobe light, illuminating a scene of pure chaos. And then the sea rose. The calm, oily sea disappeared, replaced by mountains of water. Waves 10, 15, perhaps 20 meters high rose in the darkness, crowned with ghostly foam. And it was here that the fatal mistake of the Mongols' Topic 24 exacted its price: the chained fleet. A ship adrift, however skillfully piloted, would have had difficulty. But it would have had a chance. It would have ridden the face of the wave, swayed over its crest, and descended into the trough, dancing with the storm. But the Mongol ships couldn't dance. They were chained. When the first monstrous wave struck the formation, the effect was cataclysmic. One ship was attempting to ride the wave, but was pulled down by the ship beside it, which was still in the trough. The tension in the iron chain became astronomical. The chain did not break. It acted like a deadly anchor. The rising ship, unable to complete its movement, was turned on its side. The next wave, just seconds away, struck its exposed hull with the force of 1,000 battering rams. The sound of the wood cracking wasn't that of a twig, but of an entire forest being broken in two. Massive hulls, hastily constructed from uncured green wood Topic 8, shattered like nutshells. Masts meters in diameter cracked and collapsed, crushing hundreds of men on deck. The ships, linked together, collided with unbelievable violence, smashing each other into wreckage. The planks that connected them became bridges to nowhere before being swept away. Men screamed in Mongolian, Korean, and Chinese, but their cries were instantly swallowed by the howling wind. They were thrown from the decks into a black, turbulent sea where drowning was not the only danger. The air was filled with debris, broken masts, deck planks, supply barrels, all flying at 150 kilometers per hour, turning the air into a deadly shrapnel field. For 48 hours, the storm raged. When it finally passed, what remained of the largest armada in history was unrecognizable. Imari Bay was no longer a bay. It was a landfill of wreckage. The sea was so full of sunken ships, broken timber, and bloated bodies that it was said a person could walk for miles over the wreckage without touching the water. Of the 4,400 ships, perhaps a few hundred survived, irreparably damaged. Of the 140,000 men, tens of thousands died, drowned, crushed, or of hypothermia. The Dragon Armada had been wiped from existence. The storm's fury subsided, revealing a gray daylight and a sea covered in debris. But for tens of thousands of Mongol, Korean, and Chinese soldiers, the nightmare was far from over. They had survived the impossible: drowning, crushing, and exposure, clinging to planks, broken masts, or simply swimming through a sea of bodies. Thousands of them were washed ashore on the very beaches they had tried to conquer for 2 months. They arrived on land not as an army, but as castaways. They were exhausted, traumatized, soaked, and mostly unarmed. They had lost their spears, their bows, their armor. Their only hope was to find fresh water, food, and perhaps surrender. What they found were the samurai. For the Japanese defenders, who had watched the storm with a mixture of terror and reverence, the sight of their enemies being spewed by the sea was a divine sign. Their months of frustration, their pent-up anger, and their need for glory exploded. This was not a battle, it was a hunt. The samurai, who had spent weeks cursed behind their wall, topic 11, and envious of the heroes of the night raids, topic 15, finally had their opportunity for merit. But the enemy they were facing was not the armored demon they feared. It was a mass of exhausted men, barely able to stand on the sand. The samurai infantry, the IJRU, and the samurai themselves, on horseback, descended upon the beaches. The massacre was methodical and merciless. There was no attempt to take prisoners en masse. Every shipwrecked person was a target, an opportunity for a head, topic 30. The samurai galloped through the surf, their katana is going up and down, cutting down men who barely had the strength to lift their hands. There was a brutal distinction, documented by contemporary sources. Mongol and Korean soldiers, seen as the true enemies and the architects of the invasion, were hunted down and killed without exception. Their bodies were left to rot on the beaches as a warning. For the Chinese soldiers in the south, however, the Japanese sometimes showed a calculated form of mercy. They viewed the Chinese not as invaders, but as subjects enslaved by the Mongols, topic 9. Instead of killing them immediately, the Japanese rounded up many of the Chinese survivors and enslaved them, putting them to work rebuilding the temples and walls that the invasion itself had threatened. For these Chinese, survival simply meant exchanging one master for another. Some more organized groups of Mongols managed to land on nearby islands, such as Takashima, and attempted a final defense. The samurai launched amphibious attacks against them, encircling and exterminating them to the last man. By the end of the week, tens of thousands of men who had survived the greatest storm of the century had died at the hands of Japanese infantry on the beaches of Kyushu. When the last invader was killed and the sea finally calmed, Japan fell silent. The nation, on the brink of annihilation, had survived. But how? The answer was obvious to everyone, from the peasant to the emperor in Kyoto. Yes, the stone wall had been ingenious, topic 11. Yes, the night attacks by heroes like Takazaki Suenaga had been an inspiring feat of bravery, topics 15, 19. But no human action alone could have destroyed 4,000 ships and 100,000 men. The answer had come from heaven. It had been the storm. Do you remember the spiritual mobilization? The emperor's incessant prayers, the rituals performed in all the shrines, the fervent belief that Japan was Shin, Koku, the land of the gods. Topic 7. Now this faith had been vindicated in the most dramatic and unequivocal way imaginable. The gods had responded. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and Raijin, the thunder god, looked down, saw the bravery of their samurai fighting against impossible odds, and decided to intervene. A new term has been born, Kamikaze, literally, divine wind. This was not merely a name for a storm. It was the cornerstone of a new national theology, Kamikaze. It was physical and irrefutable proof that Japan was special. It was the chosen land, protected by it and was therefore invincible. No foreign power, not even that of the all-powerful Kublai Khan, could conquer a people who enjoyed such divine favor. This belief had profound and lasting consequences. It cemented the idea of Japanese uniqueness and a unified national identity against a barbaric outside world. It reinforced the spiritual power of the imperial line, which had led the prayers that were believed to summon the wind. And it created a dangerous narrative that bravery and faith alone could invoke miracles to overcome overwhelming material odds. This idea that pure spirit could overcome technology and logistics would become deeply ingrained in the Japanese military psyche. 700 years later, at the end of World War II, when Japan was once again on the brink of annihilation, this time against the American Navy, the desperate nation would resort to this same myth. They would name their suicide pilots Kamikaze, in the hope that a final human sacrifice could, once again, summon a divine wind to save the nation. The myth, born in Hakata Bay in 1281, proved to be one of the most potent and enduring cultural forces in Japanese history, a story of faith, destiny, and the terrifying power of a storm. When the howl of Kamikaze, topic 28, finally ceased and the massacre on the beaches, topic 27, subsided, the real work of the samurai began. The war had been a desperate defense of the nation, But for the individual warriors who fought in it, it had been, above all, an investment. Now, it was time to present the receipts, and in feudal Japan, a warrior's receipt was the head of his enemy. What followed on the beaches of Hakata was not a celebration, but a macabre exercise in accounting. The code of primitive Bushido Topic 13 was not based on abstract notions of honor, but on tangible evidence of Meretha Sharushith. Samurai and their retainers methodically traversed the vast expanse of wreckage, walking among the thousands of bloated bodies that the sea had spewed out in search of trophies. This was not a random desecration. It was a bureaucratic process. The head of a Mongol common soldier or a Chinese conscript had some value, but the real prize was an officer. A samurai would look for bodies with finer lamellar armor, decorated helmets, or officer's boots. When a valuable target was found, the head was removed with a dagger. Tantive hair was then tied in a knot, and a wooden tag bearing the name of the samurai who claimed it was firmly attached. These heads were taken to inspection posts hastily set up behind the wall, Ganko Borowithan. Shogunate officials, Theophan inspectors, sat before growing piles of these trophies. Their job was to register them. The samurai presented his head. Theophan would examine it, noting its likely rank based on its features or any armor that accompanied it, and record the samurai's name in a ledger. This list was the basis for all future reward claims. The scale of this head count was unimaginable. Tens of thousands of invaders died. Although most were swallowed by the sea, the thousands who reached the shore were systematically processed in this way. For the samurai, this act was not sadistic. It was professional. It was the only way to prove that they were not hiding behind a wall, but that they had actively participated in the destruction of the enemy, whether on the beach or in raids. Yochi. Each head represented a promise of land, a title, or a monetary reward. This brutal practice underscores the reality of the Kamakura War. The divine wind could have saved Japan, but it was the men who fought, and those men expected to be paid. The problem, which would soon become painfully clear, was that the shogunate had collected the receipts, but lacked the funds to pay the bill. The head count was the beginning of an accounting crisis that would shake the very foundations of the government. Among the victorious warriors awaiting their reward was our historical protagonist, Takazaki Suinaga, Topic 15. He had personified the spirit of the Japanese offensive. Defying logic, he had been among the first to volunteer for the suicidal night attacks. He had rowed into the Black Fleet, boarded enemy ships, and fought through the terror on deck. Topic 19. He had survived through sheer willpower and skill. He had earned his merit. In the aftermath of the storm, Suinaga waited and waited, but no word came from the officials in Hakata. No land grant, no prize horse, no title. Suinaga's problem was the problem of thousands. The shogunate bureaucracy was completely overwhelmed. Inspectors had registered thousands of claims. Topic 29, but the central government in Kamakura had no plan to pay them. Worse still, the feudal system relied on the testimony of a superior. Suinaga's commander had died in battle, leaving him with no one to officially attest to his bravery. He was just another name on an endless list of claimants. But Takazaki Suinaga was not a man to accept oblivion. Just as he had done after the first invasion of 1274, he decided to take his case directly to the top. His frustration was immense. He had risked his life, spent his own money, and obeyed the order to counterattack, and the system was failing him. In an act of incredible audacity, he embarked on the long and expensive journey from Kyushu to the shogunate capital, Kamakura, hundreds of kilometers away. But he knew that his word, or even the heads he had collected, would not be enough. Therefore, he invested what remained of his possessions, or perhaps incurred more debt, to commission a masterpiece of personal propaganda. The Mukoshrai Ikotoba, the illustrated scrolls of the Mongol invasion. These scrolls were, in essence, a visual court case. Suinaga hired artists to paint, in vivid and heroic detail, every moment of his participation. The scrolls show him disobeying orders to attack in 1274. They show him riding fearlessly. And, crucially, they show him in his small boat, Kobayashi in 1281. Boarding the great Mongol ship, his sword gleaming as he leaps onto the deck. With these scrolls under his arm, he marched to the capital and secured an audience with one of Japan's highest-ranking officials, Adachi Yasumori. He unrolled the scrolls and, with the passion of a wronged man, narrated his own story, pointing to the images that proved his worth. The tactic worked. Suenaga's audacity, combined with this undeniable visual proof, impressed Yasunori. Suenaga was rewarded. He was granted a prize horse and, more importantly, the lucrative position of administrator of a fiefdom. Suenaga was a success story. But his success was the exception that proved the rule. He was only paid because he was stubborn, boisterous, and wealthy enough to create one of the most famous pieces of art in Japanese history as his resume. Thousands of other samurai, who had fought with equal bravery but lacked his resources or connections, received nothing. Suenaga's disappointment was resolved, but that of an entire generation of warriors was only beginning. Takazaki Suenaga's bureaucratic struggle, Topic 30, was not caused by pettiness or ingratitude on the part of the Kamakura shogunate. It was caused by a catastrophic and fundamental flaw in its own economic model. The feudal system that had kept Japan united for a century simply was not designed for this type of warfare. The Kamakura shogunate was, in essence, a military structure where loyalty was bought with land. Shogun Hei was the greatest landowner in Japan. The samurai Gokuninthi swore military service to him in exchange for the promise that, after a successful campaign, they would be rewarded. In all previous wars in Japanese history, this had been a civil war, one clan against another. The system worked perfectly. If the Hojo clan, the ruling clan of the shogunate, defeated, say, the Miura clan, the shogunate would confiscate all the vast landholdings belonging to the Miura clan. These lands then became the spoils of war. The shogunate kept a portion and distributed the rest, rice fields, villages, tax collection rights, to the samurai who had fought most bravely. Loyalty was rewarded with tangible, income-generating goods. The system was self-sustaining. But the Mongol invasion broke that model. The samurai fought, they bled, they won. They presented their heads, Topic 29, and demanded their payment. The problem was, what payment? Whose lands was the shogunate going to confiscate? The enemy was Kublai Khan. His lands were in Beijing, in Xanadu, on the Mongolian steppe. The victory over his fleet yielded the shogunate not a single hectare of new rice paddy. The spoils were merely a sea of broken timber and decaying corpses. For the first time in its history, the shogunate had won an all-out war and, as a result, was poorer than when it began. Not only were there no new goods to distribute, but the government itself was financially ruined. Preparations for war had been astronomically expensive. The construction of the 20-kilometer stone wall, the Genk Barui, Topic 6, had required years of work and special fees. The mobilization of thousands of samurai from across the country, the maintenance of constant coastal patrols for 7 years, and the supply of weapons and provisions had depleted Kamakura's treasury. Regent Hojo Tokimune found himself in an impossible situation. He was in command of an army of victorious heroes and had absolutely nothing to give them. He couldn't pay the bills his own warriors were presenting him with. The greatest military victory in Japanese history was simultaneously its greatest economic disaster. The bounty crisis was not a question of if, but when it would fracture samurai society itself. Japan's victory was sealed. The divine wind had purified the waters, and the heads of the enemies had been counted. Topic 29. But for the average samurai, now returning from his post in Hakata Bay to his country home, the reality of his situation was beginning to set in. He had gone to war as a noble warrior. He returned as a hero, and as a man on the verge of ruin. Honor was his reward. But honor doesn't pay debts. What is often forgotten is that warfare in feudal Japan was a BYOB undertaking. Bring your own Bushido. The Kamakura shogunate did not issue equipment. Each samurai was bound by oath to report for service, but the costs were entirely their own, and those costs were astronomical. First, there was the personal equipment. A big suit of armor, Oyoroith suit, composed of hundreds of small metal and leather plates, joined together by meters of silk, was a luxury item, the equivalent of a modern sports car. The weapons, Itachi, the long cavalry sword, Anagenatibus, and hundreds of arrows, all handmade and expensive. Then there were the horses. A samurai of stature had to have at least 2 or 3 war horses, valuable and expensive animals to maintain. Then there were his followers. A samurai did not fight alone. He had to bring his own retainers, some squires, perhaps some foot soldiers, ashigaru, and created to care for the horses and equipment. And most ruinous of all, the logistics. The samurai had to pay for the journey, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, from his home province to the meeting point in Hakata. And once there, he had to feed his entire entouragement and horses for the entire period of service. The War of 1281 was not an afternoon battle. It was a tense siege that lasted almost 2 months, preceded by years of intermittent mobilization. Where did a warrior whose wealth was entirely tied to the land and the rice harvest get this kind of cash from? He was asking to borrow it. In the years leading up to the war and during the stalemate, a new class of moneylenders had flourished. These were wealthy Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, and an emerging merchant class, all happy to lend cash to samurai in exchange for a very specific guarantee: their land. The warriors mortgaged their rice fields, their homes, their rights to Jitu, land administrator, convinced that after the victory, they would be rewarded by the shogun with new fiefdoms to Plexico, Sanchiyi, which would allow them to repay the loan with profit. Now, the unthinkable had happened. They had won, but there were no rewards. The shogunate was bankrupt. The samurai returned home with his scars and his tallies of heroism, only to be met by the debt collector. Unable to pay, the samurai watched the moneylender foreclose on the mortgage. The irony was heartbreakingly cruel. The samurai had fought to defend his land from the Mongols, only to lose it to a moneylender because he wasn't paid for his defense. Thousands of samurai families fell into poverty. Entire clans, which had been the backbone of the shogunate, were ruined. Their blood debt, the blood they had shed for the nation, translated only into financial debt. This deep and widespread resentment against the Kamakura government did not disappear. On the contrary, it festered beneath the surface, creating a generation of dispossessed and angry warriors who had lost everything but their honor. They would not forget this betrayal. The story of the Mongol invasion did not end in the 13th century. In fact, its end was only the beginning of its life as one of Japan's founding myths. Its impact on Japanese culture and how it saw itself, and how it would later tell its own stories, is incalculable. And at the heart of this is the very source that allows us to see the war. The Muko Shrai, Ikotababi, Takezaki Suenaga, Top Hik 30. These scrolls are not just a historical document. They are, as many art historians argue, one of the oldest and clearest examples of proto-manga in the world. The scrolls Makono narrative picture scrolls were common at the time, but they generally depicted courtly tallies, romances, or religious legends. Thiko Tobasanaga's work was different. It was a first-person action report. Its structure is undeniably modern. It uses sequential art, one image after another, to show movement and the passage of time. It has a clear and heroic protagonist, Suenaga himself. It has text kotobagaki that functions almost like captions or thought bubbles, explaining Suenaga's motivation and what he shouted during the battle. And it has explosive action, with vivid depictions of bombs, flying arrows, and hand-to-hand combat. It is, in essence, a 13th century war manga, a personal propaganda tool so effective that it established a model for heroic visual storytelling. But the broadest influence came from the Mest, the invasion solidified in the Japanese cultural psyche. The first, of course, is the myth of Kamikaze. Topic 28. The idea that Japan is a divine land, protected by supernatural intervention against overwhelming odds, has become a cornerstone of Japanese exceptionalism. The second theme is that of spirit versus material. The Mongol Empire was the world's greatest war machine, with overwhelming numbers, superior technology, gunpowder, and unstoppable logistics. In contrast, Japan possessed the spirit, courage, and faith of its warriors, and spirit prevailed. This narrative that pure will and spiritual courage can defeat a materially superior enemy would become a central theme in Japanese military and popular culture, reaching its tragic peak in the propaganda of World War II. And the third, perhaps the most resonant in modern pop culture, is the archetype of the 80 samurai. The story of the Ataxuchi, topic 19, small elite groups, operating in the shadows, using asymmetrical guerrilla tactics to overthrow a gigantic, monolithic empire, is a narrative model we see repeated time and time again. It's the story of the specialist versus the brute, of stealth versus brute force. This historical event provided the DNA for countless stories of elite hero teams, ninjas, and lone warriors facing impossible odds. It is a testament to the power of this story that, more than 700 years later, one of the most acclaimed video games of the modern era, Ghost of Tsushima, it is based directly on this exact conflict, centering its gameplay on the tension between the honor of the samurai, duels, and the tactics of the ghost guerrilla warfare. Yaochi, born from the despair of this very event, the resistance against the Mongols was not only fought with steel, it was immortalized in ink, becoming an eternal pillar of Japanese narrative. The Mongol invasion was the 9/11ths of feudal Japan. It was a profound psychological trauma that fundamentally redefined its relationship with the outside world. Before the invasions, Japan was undoubtedly an insular and relatively isolated nation. However, it maintained active, albeit controlled, diplomatic and commercial relations with Korea and Song Dynasty China. There was an influx of Buddhist monks, trade in ceramics, and philosophical texts. The outside world was viewed cautiously, but also as a source of culture and commerce. After 1281, that door slammed shut. The outside world ceased to be a trading partner or a cultural rival. It became, unequivocally, an existential threat. The lesson Japan learned from the invasion was not one of trust or coexistence. The lesson was, they will come to destroy us. Kamikaze. It was seen not only as a blessing, but as a confirmation. The gods had protected Japan. It was a land of the god Shinkoku topics, 7 and 28 pure and separate. The desecration of the island by foreign barbarians had nearly led to disaster. The logical conclusion was that to maintain divine favor and ensure survival, the desecration could not happen again. This spiritual fortress mentality translated into practical policy. The Kamakura shogunate, despite its bankruptcy, was forced to keep the country on a war footing for decades. Kublai Khan did not accept his defeat. Humiliated and furious, he began to plan a third the invasion, gathering resources and ships until his death in 1294. For Japan, the threat had not ended with the storm. The monster was still out there. The result was a deep and lasting distrust of anything or anyone non-Japanese. Official trade was reduced. Travel to the mainland became suspect. Where there had once been monks and merchants, now there was only a fortified coastline and constant patrols. This mentality should not be confused with the policy of Sakoku, a country in chains. The total and hermetic isolation implemented centuries later by the Tokugawa shogunate. But it was here, in the aftermath of the Mongol invasion, that the psychological and political seeds of this future isolation were planted. Xenophobia became a tool of national security. Japan turned inward, convinced that its unique culture and divine lineage could only survive through vigilance and separation. Kamikaze had saved Japan, but it had also cornered it. It had proven that they were alone, protected only by their gods and their seas. It was a lesson that would define their foreign policy for the next 600 years. Until another foreign fleet, Commodore Perry's black ships, in 1853, forced them to open up again. Japan was saved. The Kamikaze, he had rewritten the nation's destiny, topic 28, and the greatest empire the world had ever known had been defeated, humiliated, and expelled. Hojo Tokimune, the ruler who defied Kublai Khan, was vindicated as the savior of his people. But this glorious victory was the swan song of his regime. The military victory of the Kamakura shogunate was its political and economic suicide. In the decades following 1281, the bounty crisis, topic 31, became a terminal political illness. The shogunate, bankrupt from war and without land to distribute, could not pay the thousands of samurai who had mortgaged everything to defend the country, topic 32. The feudal loyalty system, based on the exchange of military service for land reward, was irrevocably broken. The relationship between the ruler, the Hojo clan, and his warrior-class Gokanate disintegrated. Where there was once loyalty, now there was resentment. Where there was trust, now there was debt. The samurai, ruined and dispossessed, saw the shogunate not as their protector, but as an insolvent employer. The Hojo clan, which had ruled with an iron fist, now seemed weak, ungrateful, and incompetent. In 1297, in a desperate attempt to alleviate the pressure, the shogunate issued an act of virtue, Thaidokusei Rei. This order was essentially a mass debt forgiveness, canceling many of the mortgages the samurai had taken out. On paper, it seemed like a solution. In reality, it was a disaster. The moneylenders, wealthy temples, and the emerging merchant class that had provided the vital capital were furious and, from that moment on, refused to lend any more money to the warrior class. Credit dried up. The samurai, though free of some debts, had no new capital to manage their lands or rebuild their lives. Tokusei Riet was a band-aid that only further infected the economic wound. This vacuum of loyalty and power was the powder keg. The match was lit by a figure in Kyoto, Emperor Go-Daigo. Seeing the shogunate weakened and its warriors discontented, Go-Daigo launched a rebellion in 1331 known as the Genko War. With the aim of breaking military dominance and restoring direct imperial power, a Kenmu restoration. The Kamakura shogunate, now in a panic, did what it had always done. It summoned its vassals to crush the rebellion. The one chosen to lead the main army was one of Gokanina Mong. The most powerful and respected was Ashikaga Takagi, but Takagi was a product of the post-invasion era. He perfectly understood the resentment of the samurai. He knew that the shogunate no longer had moral or financial authority. In 1333, in a moment of betrayal that defined an era, Ashikaga Takauji, instead of attacking Emperor Go-Daigo in Kyoto, turned his army around. He allied himself with the emperor and marched on the shogunate garrison. Almost simultaneously, Anna Thurgo Kanindantans, Nita Yoshisada marched directly on the capital, Kamakura. The Kamakura shogunate, the regime that had challenged and defeated the most powerful man on earth, Kublai Khan, couldn't even defend its own city. The capital was invaded and burned. The last rulers of the Hojo clan, cornered and watching their world crumble, committed mass suicide. 52 years after its greatest victory, the Kamakura shogunate was destroyed. It was not overthrown by an external enemy, but imploded from within, devoured alive by the economic crisis that its own victory created. The heroes of Hakata, the samurai who saved Japan, became its gravediggers. The post-war scenario was one of chaos. The brief Kenmu restoration failed. Ashikaga Takuji betrayed the emperor and established his own shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate, plunging Japan into a new and even bloodier era of civil wars, the Nanbokucho period, and eventually the Sengoku period. Victory over the Mongols saved Japan, but destroyed peace.